Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the On the Sidelines series presentation today. My name is Sharon Kane. I'm director of our professional and academic programs here at the Alumni Association, and on behalf of the Alumni Association, we welcome you. Happy to have you. So this is an example, the On the Sidelines series, of our academic programs that helps us foster that part of our mission around lifelong learning. So again, thank you. So today's presentation is Pope Francis in America, Impact, Insights, and Inspirations. It's with Dr. Kathleen Cummings. It was just 8 weeks ago that Pope Francis was here in the United States. And people were riveted, they were uplifted, they were really captivated by him. And in his visit, who was he talking to? What did he say in those encounters? And what could we learn about this man? And it was in that same week that Kathleen had an NPR interview, and they asked the question about why the Pope is resonating so much here in America. And she responded by saying, "The key to his popularity here in the United States for Catholics and non-Catholics is that from the very beginning of his pontificate, he established a great deal of moral credibility in those early gestures. Those symbolic moves he made in those first couple of days. He's continued that by forefronting issues that lead with the positive. He said very early on that the church should focus on the things it says yes to. The message is about the positive rather than all the things the church says no to." So today we're going to be able to relive some of that historic visit through the valued perspective of our expert, Dr. Kathleen Cummings. Dr. Cummings provided on-air commentary for NBC and MSNBC, and so today she's going to share with you her pictures and her stories. So by way of introduction, Dr. Cummings is an associate professor of American Studies and has a joint appointment in history, so she's in the College of Arts and Letters. And since 2012, she served as director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism here at Notre Dame. She's authored several books, a couple in process. The title Citizen Saints, Catholics and Canonization in American Culture, Catholicism in the American Century, and New Women of the Old Faith, Gender and American Catholic Identity in the Progressive Era. Kathy has earned both her master's and PhD in history here at Notre Dame, and she's a wonderful friend to us here in the Alumni Association. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathleen Cummings.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for all you did to organize this event. It's a pleasure to be here. You said 8 weeks ago, and wow, it was 8 weeks ago. It seems like a lot longer ago. And this has really given me an opportunity to, the opportunity to speak today has given me a chance to sit back and reflect on what it was all like. Because as you can imagine, when I was going through it, it was moving at a very fast clip, and I didn't have a lot of time for reflection. So I really appreciate this 2 months later to pause and kind of reflect and remember what it was all about. And I'm particularly grateful to be here under the auspices of the Alumni Association, because this is really an alumni story. It's a great Notre Dame story of how, as a fifth grader at our parish school said, how did a history teacher get to be on TV? I gave a presentation there, and they know me as Mrs. Cummings, TC and Margaret and Annie's mom, who teaches history. So they were a little puzzled by what I was doing on TV, as I have been at different points over the last 2.5 years. And the simple answer to that question has to do with a dear friend of mine and a very famous Notre Dame alumna, Ann Thompson, class of 1979, a member of the Board of Trustees, and we're pictured here together. Ann is a correspondent, has been a correspondent for NBC for a long time, and when Pope Benedict resigned in February of 2013, you know, and if you recall just how momentous that announcement was, and I mean, there was just everybody, they were asking everyone to interpret and comment, and Anne was doing her work for NBC, and she noticed that a lot of the people doing the commenting were men, and she thought it would be really great to get more women's voices into the mix. So she called her good friend, Sheila O'Brien, from Notre Dame, one of her sister Notre Dame alums, and said, you know, I'd love to find a woman to speak, but it's particularly important to find someone who's not associated with either the far right or the far left, someone who wouldn't be polarizing. And I think some of the women that were public commentators were already branded in one way. Well, of course, I wasn't associated with anything because I just taught history here in Notre Dame. No one had ever heard of me in the TV world. But Sheila said to Anne, she said, "You've got to meet Professor Cummings." And I had known Sheila because I had done some media work, not TV, but a lot of comments for newspapers and a little radio in connection with American Catholic Sisters, which is one of my areas of expertise. So Sheila, I had met Sheila through that, and Sheila said, "You've got to," so Sheila connected us. And sure enough, in those 5 weeks in between the resignation of Pope Benedict and the conclave that elected Pope Francis, I did a lot of segments for nightly news, other outlets as well, but it seemed that NBC was because of the connection with Anne, was the one I did the most with, from right over here at WNDU. And it was all kind of really fun and new and a challenge for me. I mean, one of the things that professors do is to, in our writing most of the time, it seems like we try to make things as complex as possible. You know, you've got to explain every nuance. That's how we speak to each other. So it's very different and good practice to kind of make things to boil them down, not dumb them down, but to explain it in very short segments. And it was something that is not always easy. It still is not very easy for me. But NBC had asked me to be, they said, "Well, will you go to the studio when we see white smoke?" You know, and I said, "Sure, that sounds like fun." And so I did. And I was, so this picture, the bottom picture here is me right at NDU again. And I was live with Brian Williams when Pope Francis was elected. Now, I later learned that I did absolutely everything wrong in this little segment. I spoke for 1 minute and 12 seconds, which is like forever in TV world. Like, you should never speak that long. I wore a scarf, apparently. You shouldn't wear a scarf, it's too distracting, whatever. Anyway, it was fun. You know, Brian and I got to chat about Notre Dame, and Anne had been on as well, so it was a great Notre Dame moment. And I walked out of that studio that day in March of 2013, and I thought, this has been great. You know, what a blast I've had for the last 5 weeks, you know, dashing to the studio and, you know, and it's over, right? Because we have a pope, so there's no story here. And of course, was I ever wrong, and was very happy to be wrong. And sure enough, Pope Francis very early on was providing all sorts of opportunities for the news outlets. So I would, you know, periodically get called to go do a quick thing for the Today Show or nightly news, again, through the connection with Anne. And then in April of 2014, when Pope John Paul II and Pope John XXIII were canonized, I'm writing a book about canonization right now. So NBC asked me to come to New York to 30 Rock and do kind of live commentary on the canonization mass from the studio with, at that point, Lester Holt. And it was kind of like the Olympics, providing live commentary on the Olympics, only it was a canonization mass. It was all very exciting and fun, but that was something new to actually be in New York in the studio. So I was, and I had a great time. So I was really then excited when Pope Francis announced his visit, and Anne Thompson was actually the one that broke the story when she was on the plane with him. I believe it was his trip to Korea. She asked him in Italian, "Pope Francis, are you coming to Philadelphia?" And he said, "Yes, I am." So even though there had been rumors, she was the one that actually got the commitment from him, got him to say it first. So as plans started to move forward for that, the people at NBC Specials asked me if I'd be willing to come to New York or Philadelphia or wherever he was going to be for a more extended period of time and be identified as a papal expert. So I said, yeah, why not? Of course I would. So that's a little bit about how I got into this, but this experience was truly exhilarating, and I thought I'd just share some of my perspectives on it, and the perspective I brought to much of the commentary, which is my perspective as a historian and what this visit meant in the grand sweep of U.S. history, and as well as some other perspectives. I wanted to talk about how I prepared for this. I did present, as I mentioned, to the children at my parish school, and I took a picture of the stack there on your right, which are my notes for this, and articles that I printed out. I read several biographies of Francis, and of course, keep up very assiduously with the news in a way that I hadn't necessarily done for the last 2.5 years, but I try to be as on top of it as possible. But for this, I had a big binder, which my colleague Pete here helped me assemble. It had all little tabs. It was all very well organized. But that's just some of the material that I brought with me to New York. Now, on air, I probably said maybe 5% of what is in that, but I needed to know all of that and bring it with me. I took the picture when I was preparing to speak to the children because I wanted to talk to them about homework, and Pope Francis and his visit to the school in Brooklyn had given the children their homework to pray for him. So I was going along with the theme that everybody does homework, and here was my homework for Pope Francis, but I thought it might be fun to show here too, just a little bit. And then the picture on the left is, this is a picture of me in my office with a Jesuit who's very important figure in my life, Father Bernard McElhenney, or Father Mac, as everyone calls him. He was Dean of Admissions at the University of Scranton when I was admitted there back in 1989. And I wanted to, even though this is primarily a story about being a Notre Dame alum and the connections, I also wanted to speak just briefly about the Jesuit education that I had there, because that is something that I've really come to appreciate even more through Francis's pontificate. I think understanding him as a Jesuit and watching the way he speaks and the way he talks about being a Jesuit has helped me appreciate my own education. And the other thing I did, in addition to all the reading I did to prepare for this visit, I had a lot of conversations with people. I wrote emails to people, lots of different people, had lots of conversations with students here at Notre Dame, administrators, other faculty, and I would just ask them, probably for the last couple months or so, I'd say, how has Pope Francis changed your life? Has he? And if so, how? And would you be willing to share it with me? Just so I would have a broader perspective other than my own opinion or things that I was reading, just to get a sense. And it really did come in handy because Brian Williams sure is a big fan of Notre Dame, and he would ask me a lot when I was on air, well, what are they saying at Notre Dame about this? And I could respond with some, with at least some claim to have spoken to a lot of people at Notre Dame and beyond. But this conversation with Father Mac, he's turning 90, and I hadn't seen him in about 10 years, and it just so happened that he was on campus the day before I left to go to New York. And I was able to speak to him about Pope Francis, about being a Jesuit, about my own education at a Jesuit university and how that continues to shape me. And we were able to pray together about it. And also I was telling him, I said, I'm really nervous. I've never done anything like this before. I'm going to be, what if someone asks me a question I don't know? And we talked a lot about one of the key elements of Ignatian spirituality is the idea that everything you do should be directed to the service of God. And he said, just think of this all you're doing here, this is another way to speak about God. He said, God's going to give you the words. And it just, it really, I kept that with me throughout the week. And I was asked some tough questions. And I do believe that God gave me the words often in some of those occasions, and I'll talk about them a little bit. So anyway, then I was in New York for most of the week, and so I was watching in the studio and actually live with Brian Williams when Pope Francis arrived at Joint Base Andrews. And this is where I was a little surprised at how, at my reaction as a historian, to see Pope Francis at this moment, the next day in the White House, to see him, and then later in those other iconic American spaces, the Joint Session of Congress, Independence Hall, because in the long sweep of U.S. history, the Pope was certainly not welcome in those spaces. we celebrated in October the 50th anniversary of the first sitting pope to visit the United States, Paul VI, in 1964, almost exactly 50 years before Pope Francis arrived. And Pope Paul did not go to the White House. He visited with Lyndon Johnson in New York. Part of that had to do with the fact that Vatican II was happening in Rome. It was not a long visit. It was, the visit lasted 14 hours. Pope Paul spoke at the UN. But another factor driving it was that even in 1964, after there had been a Catholic already in the White House, the idea that there would be, that the Pope would visit the White House was something that was still not have been widely accepted, would have been highly suspicious. And throughout American history, there have been, for most of American history, the idea that many people believe that the Pope had designs on the United States, that was trying to take over the United States. A lot of the media, some of the headlines I saw in the run-up to this, especially in New York, where they were putting the barricades up everywhere and it was all kind of hard to get around. They talked about a papal invasion, but they used to mean, that term used to mean a real invasion. And in the early 19th century, many Americans believed that the Pope did want to come and invade the United States. And so I just, tried to put a little perspective on that. This is one of the cartoons I often show in my classes. It's from September 1894, the American Pope. And what we see pictured here, the Pope Leo XIII at the time had just appointed an apostolic delegate to the United States, a representative, not an ambassador. There was not official diplomatic relations between the US and the Vatican until 1984. Just 30 years ago. But in 1893, there was an apostolic delegate appointed, and it provoked commentaries like this one. So you see pictured here, sitting on top of the dome there, American headquarters, the belt of the person reads Satoli, and that was the name of the cardinal that was appointed the papal representative to the United States. But the shadow he's casting is one of Pope Leo XIII, and anyone would have recognized his shadow there. And you can see the shadow is cast over the Capitol, over much of the American West. A few years before, there was an article printed in the Atlantic Monthly, so a respectable journal, written by an American professor who said that he had seen more detailed maps of the American West in the halls of the Vatican than he had ever seen at an American university, that the Pope was relying on the Jesuits, really, to direct transatlantic migration to strategic points in the U.S. West to prepare the way for a papal invasion. This was a very common sentiment in the 19th century. The year that Satoli was appointed, 1893, there was a severe depression, the worst economic depression in the country's history. It will later be surpassed, of course, by the Great Depression. But there was an organization called the American Protective Association that had been founded in Clinton, Iowa in 1887 by a man who believed that, the Catholics, and particularly the Jesuits, were the worst. And to become a member of the American Protective Association, all you had to do was promise that you would never hire a Catholic if someone else was available, you'd never vote for a Catholic, and you'd never go on strike with a Catholic. This organization grew slowly until 1893, until the economic depression, when the founder of this organization was able to distribute pamphlets suggesting that Pope Leo had created a run on US banks so as to weaken the economy to prepare for a papal invasion. And then the membership exploded in the American Protective Association. So all this is just to give a little perspective about, to be able to see how excited people were, all Americans, Catholic, non-Catholic, and how welcome Pope Francis was in these, again, iconic American spaces where Catholics weren't even welcome until fairly recently, let alone their spiritual leaders. So I was quite moved by much of that. And to the, I wasn't able to talk about that much on TV because, again, you're just talking very short segments, but I was able to do a few radio interviews. The NPR interview that Sharon quoted, the producer of that program called one morning, and I was in New York, and she said, Robin Young, she has this idea that, everybody's so excited about Pope Francis, and maybe it wasn't always that way with popes, and I don't know, is there a story there? And I said, oh yes, there is. So that was really fun. Okay, so I thought I'd just talk a little bit about my day at 30 Rock when I worked there. All the days start out with this. This is my glam squad. I just thought that was funny. You sit in a chair, whatever time you get there. Most days I had to be there by about 5:30 in the morning because you do these things with all the affiliates where it's a lead-in to the Today Show, so I'd have about 8 or 9 places throughout the country where I'd have to just talk for a minute and a half or something about the visit, and they would use that. And it was, it was very early in the morning, and you have this little earpiece in your ear, and they say, okay, now we're moving to Atlanta, Georgia, and you'll be talking to Mark and Jennifer, and I do that, and then we move to Sacramento, California, where I'm talking to Susan and Rob. And so I never used any names because I thought I'm going to be talking about Mark and Jennifer in Sacramento, and nobody's going to know what I'm talking about. But anyway, this is where the day started, so it was really good to be there at 5:30 in the morning to have my crew, my glamour crew. And then I would do interviews with some of the shows. This is Tamron Hall, who I didn't know before this visit, but she hosts a show on MSNBC and hosts the Today Show a lot. And she was really fun. You can see in front of me is that book that was on the top of my pile back here. So what I would do is if I had an idea of what the interview was about, and I often didn't, most of the time didn't, I would write out just a few thoughts in that notebook. So that became my trusty notebook that came with me wherever I went. It's funny, Tamron, I learned, is obsessed with babies, as apparently Pope Francis, because when we were watching, we'd be watching him live, and I think one Secret Service agent did a count of 19 babies that he kissed throughout the visit, and but Tamron would get super excited. She said, "Oh, there's a baby! There's a baby! There's a baby!" And she would just kind of freak out at the idea that Pope Francis might be kissing a baby. I thought of her when I saw this segment in Philadelphia. This was my favorite, Baby Pope. My college roommate was standing right next to, right across from Baby Pope, and just said it was wonderful to see Pope Francis's deep belly laugh when he saw that. This is actually a baby girl named Quinn from Philadelphia. But anyway, I thought of Tamron when that happened. The other thing about the Tamron interview, one of the questions she asked me was, we were looking at Pope Francis's itinerary and where he was going, and he went to a homeless shelter in D.C. He did, and he was also meeting at various times with private benefactors. And she asked me something to the effect of, how do you think he feels about meeting with wealthier people? He seems to so enjoy being with people on the margins. And I said, Pope Francis really, in this respect, reminds me of an adage that's often attributed to Dorothy Day. He wants to comfort the afflicted, but also to afflict the comfortable, in the sense that Pope Francis wants to make it a church of the poor and to comfort the poor, but he also wants to make everybody uncomfortable. So that was just something that really popped into my head. And then he mentioned Dorothy Day in his in the address to the joint session of Congress. So I was kind of excited about that. Like, wow, I guess I called that one. So that was kind of fun. Later that day, so this is still the same day, this is his second day in D.C., I did live coverage for the canonization of Junipero Serra. And that was something that was really interesting to do. As I mentioned, I'm writing a book about canonization, and particularly causes for canonization that come from the United States. And I had been to the mission in Santa Barbara and examined the archives for the canonization of Serra, Franciscan missionary. And what's really interesting is that his own congregation, the Franciscans, had really given up on the cause in about 2002. They decided not to pursue it anymore because when he was beatified in 1988, and you may have followed some of this, there were indigenous protests about his canonization. But because of what he represented about European colonization, his beatification in 1988 generated a bunch of protests and continued to do so in California. So the Franciscans had stopped pursuing it, and I mean, I knew that. I had talked to them and I had read, but I was writing about this cause in my book as a cause that would remain permanently stalled, that he would stay a beato. And then I happened to mention, I was at a dinner one night, and actually Angie's husband happened to mention to me that Pope Francis had announced back in January that he was going to canonize Sarah when he visited the United States. I'm told that even his congregation, the Franciscans, didn't even know that Pope Francis just decided to do that. So I was very surprised by that. I had to change the book, had to do some quick editing on that. But anyway, to be commenting for that was interesting because it's a topic I know an awful lot about canonization, about Sarah. A colleague of mine here, the chair of my department, has written a book about the shrine of the National Basilica of the Immaculate Conception. You know, I mean, I could have talked forever about that, and again, you have to break it down into, so that was fun and interesting. But then I left that and immediately had the opposite experience where I left that, and that lasted for about 2 hours, and they said, okay, well, we want to tape an interview for the Today Show tomorrow. And I said, okay. And they don't usually tell you what the interview's about. So I got, and this was not a live interview, thank goodness, it was a taped interview, but I sat down and mic'd up and everything. They said, we want to do an interview about Monsignor Mark Miles. And I said, who is Monsignor Mark Miles? And he is the man pictured here, the interpreter, the Pope's interpreter, the guy with the dark hair and glasses standing kind of next to Pope Francis. This picture is from his visit at Catholic Charities in Washington, D.C. And Monsignor Miles, you could see him throughout the week. He was always there, always standing right next to Pope Francis. And generated kind of a fan club on social media. People wanted to know more about him, so the Today Show decided they were going to do a feature on him, and so they asked me to talk about it. And I said, well, this is going to be a very short interview because I have no idea who this guy is. I don't know anything about him. I didn't even know his name until a few moments ago. But they said, oh, well, just talk about, you know, what it's like to be an interpreter. So actually, I was able to do a pretty, you know, I started to think about what an interpreter, what role he plays in Pope Francis's visits and encounters with people. And this is a pope that we know relishes encounter. He talks about the theology of encounter. And when you watch his interactions, that was one of the things that moved me so much about watching him throughout the week, is no matter who he was talking to, whether it was the President of the United States, the Secretary General of the United Nations, homeless people in New York, children at a school, he was so present and so close to them. And it's one of the reasons why Americans were so excited about his visit and have resonated so much with him is many of them feel a closeness to him and a proximity. So I just was able in this interview to talk about how a good interpreter would be able to translate, because Pope Francis was mostly speaking Spanish and most of the people he met were speaking English, to translate without inserting himself, without disrupting that encounter. So anyway, this turned out to be one of the best interviews that was on, and it was a topic I literally knew nothing about, the complete opposite of the canonization. But it was fun, and now I know a lot about him. And fittingly, Monsignor Miles refused to be interviewed for a lot of this because he said, this is not about me. He kind of really was the great interpreter, not interfering with that. Apparently, he looks a lot like Stephen Colbert, and they did a little segment on that too, but I wasn't part of that. The joint session of Congress, the speech to that, I was also just so impressed by the way Pope Francis, you know, I teach in the History and American Studies departments here, and one of the themes we talk about a lot is the distance between American dreams and American realities, and how leaders throughout U.S. history have tried to bridge that distance by calling on the United States to live up to the ideals of its founding documents. And, you know, Pope Francis, on his first visit to the United States, in which he admitted he didn't know much about the United States, it just became so clear to me how much he had learned and how he had prepared and really tried to enter into the history of our country. So a lot of the commentary in the run-up to his visit, which was, you know, some of which was provided by me, the theme was, yes, he is coming to the United States, but his message is universal. He's not, you know, he's not speaking as an American, but he really was able to enter, I think, into our national history, into our national discourse, and in a really inspiring way. And of course, Dorothy Day was mentioned, which, you know, he reminded me of her, as I had said the day before, and then to hear an excerpt from the Seven-Story Mountain being read in Congress was, again, just incredibly moving. He mentions, of course, Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King, and in a way that really engaged their vision for what the United States could be. And I think another question I was asked a lot in the run-up to this visit is, is Pope Francis going to scold Americans, for being so capitalist or so wealthy or so, and I said, no, he's not. He doesn't, that's not what he's going to do, but what he probably will do is call on the United States to truly be the city on a hill, to live up to who we say we are as a country. And I thought he did that beautifully through the figures of Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, who he mentioned 3 times in the course of his visit. So I was just, I found that very moving, the way he was able to do that. Okay, and then New York. So this is a little bit about what I meant about papal invasion. One of the great things about working at NBC is they always send cars for you, like wherever you go, which is, I hate to drive, so it was really, that was even better than the hair and makeup crew. And the morning I got there, they said, now would you like a car the next morning at 5 o'clock or whatever when I had to be? And I said, isn't 30 Rock just a block and a half away? And they said, yeah, would you like a car? And I said, no, I think I'll be fine to walk, so I was. But then when Pope Francis arrived, the hotel I was staying at was right across from St. Patrick's, and these barricades were put up, and you actually had to walk about 3/4 of a mile north or south just to cross Fifth Avenue. And I had all sorts of security clearance ahead of time to get into NBC and to get into some of the, and I was flashing every badge I had, can I just cross Fifth Avenue? And no, you can't. You have to go all the way up. So that was a little bit unnerving. But the security was so stringent, so tight, and I knew it had to be. I had great conversations with a lot of the Secret Service agents that were positioned around the hotel, and learned a lot of things. When I was up on the roof of, I think that's the next slide. Oh no, there's my glam slide shot again. When he arrived at St. Patrick's Cathedral that Thursday, you had to have an extra level of security clearance to get on the roof of 30 Rockefeller Center and look down over the cameras were faced on where he would be arriving, and you could see all the sharpshooters on the roofs above. And actually, one of my Secret Service new friends said the correct term is counter snipers, so it's not sharpshooters. But I was asking a lot about security, and it was really. It was really kind of, but I did feel that he would be very safe. They were very confident about how they were used to dealing with these kinds of situations, and I was reassured. I found it very reassuring, I guess. Up on the roof, this additional place, there were only just a few of us, so I didn't meet him, but Tom Brokaw was like standing like over there, and Lester Holt, of course, who I do know, I had known him. But also, I noticed. A woman that I recognize, this isn't a very good picture, but the picture on the left there, I'm standing with Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is a famous historian, very well-published historian, who's been a bit of an inspiration to me in the way that she writes, and I've learned a lot from her. So I recognized her, and one of my makeup crew, people who were up there, I said, oh my gosh, it's Doris Kearns Goodwin. They said, oh, go talk to her. She's so nice, And I said, oh no, I can't go talk to her, but I finally worked up the courage, and I went and I introduced myself, and she was very gracious, and she said, oh, it's you. And the thing is, she recognized me. She said, I've been watching you for 2 days on TV. She said, because I'm here to do an interview about Pope Francis. She said, and I don't really know anything about Pope Francis. She said, but she does know a lot about leadership, and she's writing a book on leadership. So she's good friends with Brian Williams, and Brian had asked her to come down. So it was also reassuring to know that other people do interviews about things they know nothing about. But anyway, she said, so I was trying to figure out a little bit about what was going on. She said, so I had on MSNBC, and there you were. So that was really cool to have one of my kind of heroes recognize me, at least. And so we had a good talk about what that's like to be history professors who also try to translate things to a broader audience. And then, I heard a lot of people say in the run-up, people who were making the pilgrimage, that they were definitely excited to see Pope Francis and interact with Pope Francis, but they were also so interested to see they were so excited to be with other pilgrims and to feel the energy of other people. And this was really true. I didn't get anywhere close to Pope Francis, but had a chance to interact with Doris, Kearns, Goodwin. I was at the Media Center in Philadelphia at 4:30 in the morning, and I hear, "Hi, Professor Cummings," and this is a woman named Laura McChrystal, who was in my class in 2010, and now works for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And at Ground Zero, I did a pre-taped interview at Ground Zero, and I met a wonderful woman there named Stephanie, who had lost her brother on 9/11. And it was funny, the person interviewing me, Craig Melvin, said, what's it like to be a papal expert? He said that to me, and I was like, well, I don't know, I just became one. So, but she heard him wrong. So she said to me, "So you're a people expert." So what does a people expert do? And we had a good laugh about that. And then she told me a lot about her brother, John, and so we were crying together a little bit. And she was not Catholic, but she was so yearning. She said, it's been 13 years and my family is still so broken. And they were, it's been 14 years, and she said, we're so anticipating this service with Francis on Friday, looking for comfort. And so she said, "What do you think he's going to say?" And anyway, it was just a profoundly moving encounter, and I had lots of those throughout the week. So it was about all the people that Pope Francis brought together, as well as him himself. You may recognize this guy because he's a total celebrity, as I learned when I traipsed through New York and Philadelphia with him. This is Robert Barron, the author of the Catholicism series, now bishop, auxiliary bishop in Los Angeles. And on Friday night, they sent some of the NBC crew to Philadelphia, just ahead of Pope Francis. He was flying there Saturday morning. And so I was actually pulled from the set. I was sitting on the set ready to speak, and they said, "You have to go right now." Like, it's a weird thing about TV, which, everything happens kind of last minute. And all of a sudden they realized that the Mass that Pope Francis was saying at Madison Square Garden is right above Penn Station, where we were supposed to catch a train to go to Philadelphia. And so they panicked, and so we just had to all run there. So Bishop Barron and I had our luggage, and we were kind of running. And then on the train to Philadelphia, they had us read our briefing document, which, as Bishop Barron said, this is the most terrifying thing I have ever read. You would have thought we were preparing to go into a war zone. Philadelphia is not accustomed in the way that New York and DC are to visits of this magnitude, and there were perimeters, there were all these things about who had clearance, and they said, "Now we're going to get you," they had a car, of course, from the train station. They said, "We're going to get you as close as we can to your hotel, but you're going to have to go the rest of it." So we really did feel like we were on this like escapade, and we got, we did eventually get to our hotel after some, quite a bit of walking, and this is overlooking City Hall in Philadelphia at 10 p.m. on a Friday night, and the place was just empty. It was just emptied out. It was really surreal to be there. And then, there was quite a few security challenges, which is why we all had to get up so early. We had to take a bus to the site, which is it's less than a mile. We could have walked it in 10 minutes, but we had to assemble at a site 3 hours before we needed to be there so we could be bussed in, those who had security clearance. So that was another kind of fun and interesting experience. But Bishop Barron, I knew who he was. I had heard of him, but he was stopped every 2 seconds as we were walking. He was kind of a big celebrity, and people would say things like, "We don't even want to see Pope Francis, we wanted to see you." So that was kind of fun to be with him. Oh, this is Bishop Barron posted this on his Facebook page, so I copied it. This is us. I'm probably reading that little book that you could see before. This is us with Chris Matthews on Saturday morning when Pope Francis celebrated Mass at the Cathedral in Philadelphia. And I'm obviously reviewing notes there, and that was one of my favorite times to be on air because, well, first of all, I grew up in the Philadelphia area, so that was meaningful to be there. But Philadelphia was one of the epicenters of the history of anti-Catholicism that I talked about at the beginning. And the cathedral, which had been built in 1852, was originally built with no windows on the ground floor because in 1844 there had been riots in the city over anti-Catholic riots, and 2 Catholic churches had been burned. So when they were building this new cathedral, they didn't want to expose stained glass windows to such threats. So that was kind of historic. But the best part is that we got these. We always got embargoed copies of the texts. an hour ahead of time. And now we were always told Pope Francis may go off script, you can't rely on them, and of course you can't talk about them beforehand. But in fact, at that moment, I'm probably reading the embargoed homily that he gave, in which he talks about Saint Katharine Drexel. So I was looking at this, and I see Saint Katharine Drexel, and I was just so excited because I've written a lot about Katharine Drexel. She's in the book that I'm writing about American saints, but she's also, a really a holy hero of mine. And again, Pope Francis had obviously taken the time to learn about her, to learn a little bit of her story, and he shared the story. The funny thing is that George Weigel, who's the senior Vatican correspondent at NBC, he and Bishop Barron and I were part of a papal experts call ahead of time, and we were talking about what our areas of expertise could be and how we might contribute to the conversation. And he said, well, I know you're writing about this book about saints, and he said, between you and I, let's make a deal. Let's try to get Katharine Drexel a little attention. She doesn't get near the attention that she deserves. And so we kind of worked out a deal ahead of time. We were going to do the best thing we could to get Katharine Drexel. So I see this embargoed copy. I'm texting George Weigel, oh my, because he was in New York. I'm like, oh my gosh, Pope Francis is going to help us get her a little attention. So Chris Matthews, who pictured here, he said to me, he said, okay, after the homily, he said, you go, you talk as long as you want. Now, again, this is TV time. I mean, if I talked as long as I wanted, that would be, not in professor time, but in TV time. He said, I want you to talk as long as you want about her. And so I was able to talk about her story, which, if you're not familiar with it, she's a member of the Drexel family in Philadelphia. She was a debutante, she was an heiress, and she was with her sisters on one of their grand tours, and had an audience with Pope Leo XIII, the same guy whose shadow was cast over the United States, and had begged him to do something to alleviate the suffering of Native Americans in the United States and African Americans. She had traveled a great deal throughout the West with her family. And, her family, they were very generous people. They would give quite a bit of their money to the poor. They would, once a week, would invite the poor into their homes and give them clothes and food. So they were people that already did a great deal, but this was what she asked Pope Leo. And Pope Leo said to her, why not you? Why don't you do something more for African Americans and Native Americans? And when Katharine wrote about that later, she talks about bursting into tears at that moment, hearing this. She could do more. She was already doing enough, but she could do more. And she eventually founded a congregation, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, and devoted her entire family fortune to ministries for Native Americans and African Americans. And she was a tremendously influential person because of her family connections, and she wrote to President Roosevelt to support anti-lynching laws. She was really a very influential person. And Pope Francis, in his homily, told the story, what about you? And he said that's what he was here to say, to ask Americans, all Americans, what else can you be doing? So I was really excited to talk about Katharine Drexel. I also was committed to talking about women, and particularly sisters, as much as I could. And so the chance to do this, to talk about this in a meaningful and a little bit more extended way, was really gratifying. Chris Matthews was talking quite a bit about the question of women's ordination and why women can't be ordained. He was that's one of his themes, and I was able to at least add a different perspective to talk about. There have been and are many women leaders in the church, like Katharine Drexel, so it was great. Then I also wanted to make the point that yes, there's a lot more room for leadership for women in the Catholic Church, but this is a problem that is not unique to the Catholic Church, and it's a problem in all institutions, all institutions in the country and around the world, that when you go up the ranks of leadership, the percentages of women thin. And so I had just been appalled by the moment in the Republican presidential debate when this was one of the early ones when there were 10 people, and one of the questions was to name a woman to replace Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill. And I think 2 people were able to mention a viable answer. 5 of the candidates mentioned either their mother or their sister or daughter, a female relative. People mentioned Margaret Thatcher and Mother Teresa, and women who aren't American. And so I was just, this is to me, as someone who teaches women's history, that are candidates couldn't come up with, 80% of them couldn't come up with a viable candidate to be represented on American currency. So I kind of ended this little discourse with, you know, Katharine Drexel's not just a holy hero, she's an American hero, and she should replace Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill. You know, she's from a banking family. So this had a brief moment in the Twitter sphere where people were like, Katharine Drexel on the $10 bill, and I was hoping it would catch fire, but as far as I know, it has not. So anything anyone can do. I don't think this idea is going anywhere, but it was a great moment for me. This is, so here's Ann Thompson again. I hadn't seen Ann for most of this because she was always with Pope Francis. She was on the plane with him and she was wherever he was and I was in the studio. But on Saturday night at the hotel, we were able to get together briefly, and I'm pictured here with Angie Appleby-Purcell, who made the pilgrimage to Philadelphia from the Alumni Association, and Tammy Schmitz from Campus Ministry. I got a lot of lovely emails from the Notre Dame community, but the one that I treasured the most was from Father John Jenkins, who said, seeing you and Ann together, I know Father Ted is smiling at his, Father Ted Hesburgh, at his Notre Dame women representing Notre Dame. And so this was a great moment, I think, for women at Notre Dame. And then Ann and I were able to do a segment together the next morning on Sunday that was on Nightly News. And you could see we're setting up there, the stage is in the background where Pope Francis was. This was the closest I got to Pope Francis. I was in the Media Risers in Philadelphia, and he came right by, and it looks like he's, you know, at least I like to think he's directly blessing me. Of course, we all thought that. It was really great to see all the media people, many of whom were not Catholic, many of whom are Catholic, but just how excited they were. It was great to be part of that moment. It was an exhilarating week. He left early. I don't know if you were watching, but he left. He was supposed to leave at 8. He left at 7:30. We were still on air till 8 o'clock, and there was nothing we could do. And I cannot tell you how anticlimactic that last half hour was. Everybody was, the chairs were being, you know, it was getting dark. I mean, people were just so over it. I mean, most of the media people had been to Cuba with him. I mean, it was just an exhausting, incredibly long week. But we kept going. Luckily, my high school was at the band, the band that was the band from my high school was sending him off at the airport, so I was able to talk about that. I threw in a couple other things, but it all ended in a kind of flat way, and we were all traipsing back then to the hotel in Philadelphia, and a couple of us had hoped to buy some souvenirs for our children, you know, at one of the many stores where they were all shut down, and people were like, no, we're done. I mean, it was just, everybody was just, he was gone. The moment was over. But it was wonderful to have him here, and it was wonderful to be a part of it. So I know that there are probably questions. We wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. I'd be happy to talk about anything more that I talked about, or really anything at all related to the visit. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm happy to pass the mic to anyone who has a question for Dr. Cummings. Sure, Matt.
Kathy, the Pope obviously says some things that to traditionalists are a little threatening, and then sometimes he backs off a little bit in tone, not in substance. Of course, he doesn't trifle with church doctrine at all. But this week, I only saw fragmentary reports of the speech he gave just a couple of days ago, where he seemed to almost, you know, vent some frustration and basically say change is coming, change is good. And also, we once again seem to chastise those who are harsh in their, I think he was referring to bishops or hierarchy, you know, those who are harsh in their comments. So my question is whether you think this speech, I think it was a speech, not an interview, this week was any more significant than the others that he's given? Did it represent any change or tone? Or maybe I need to see the whole context of it to understand.
Yeah, I think I did, interestingly enough, we had a lecture here on Wednesday night from Joseph Zara, who's in charge of reforming, one of the people who's in charge of reforming Vatican finances. So we did talk a lot about that. I didn't see that speech as representing something different in tone. I think Pope Francis has been challenging everybody all along. I think that this moment is different from 8 weeks ago because of the Synod. I think, and the Synod really was, I mean, the visit was great for us, but the Synod was, you know, the really momentous thing. And I think the evident polarization and resistance, I think, to change may have inspired what you heard in terms of a different tone. But I think ultimately, I think, you know, Pope Francis is, he doesn't think of it in the terms that we think about it in our political culture. and that he's challenging people who identify as traditionalists as much as he's challenging people who identify as more progressive. And I think, I guess I have to be careful about criticizing the media, since I think at this point I'm part of the media. But I think that, I see a lot of fragments, that are taken from a final paragraph, that's a very complex paragraph. And that fragment becomes the buzzword, and it can be, people see in it what they want to see in it. I mean, one of our hopes, and we were kind of all talking about this informally at NBC and even on the air, is that it was such a great visit in the sense of, it really was, putting our best foot forward as a country, and it seemed that some of the divisions had healed a bit. And I know one of the segments was with Chuck Todd from Meet the Press, and where he was talking a lot about the election and how rancorous that has been, and could this be a moment to heal and have a more civil discourse, and it was, and we kind of all hoped that would be the case. And then the story about the visit with Kim Davis broke like 2 days later, and that, I think I was really disheartened by how quickly everybody went back into their boxes, as I call them. So I don't think Pope Francis is changing. He might be he might be a moment of more frustration with the pace of change, but I didn't hear a dramatically different tone. I think he wants to challenge everybody. Yeah.
Okay, well, Doctor, thank you very much for bringing us into your time there. It was like an immersion, and it was lovely. Thank you. My question was actually on Kim Davis and the from your perspective, what the effect on his visit was as a result of spending some time, those few precious moments that he has with any one subject, that he chose to do that, what the effects on his visit were as a result of that. Your comments.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm very glad that the news of that did not break until after he left, because it would have completely overshadowed, I think, most of the coverage. And I think he didn't, as far as, he didn't choose to meet with her. And I think when I heard about that, and I was kind of, I'll confess, I don't think I read a newspaper for an entire day when I got back. I was just so, and I remember walking into the Cushwa Center and saying, "Did you hear the Pope met with Kim Davis?" No, I didn't. I haven't. So I really quickly had to read that. But I was suspicious from the beginning, because most of the accounts of it were coming from her lawyer, and they said things like, we were invited by a Vatican official. And, I'm just very suspicious of that. A lot of people, they use the Vatican as this, it's a very imprecise term. And so I would have been very surprised had it been someone close to Pope Francis who had initiated that. She also said that she met with him for 15 minutes, which didn't seem right within the time frame of the visit. And so it was later. Actually, I did an interview for NBC that night where I kept saying, we don't know the whole story. All we know is what Kim Davis said about the encounter, and we don't know about this. And they actually didn't use the interview. Now, supposedly it was superseded by something that happened with the Secret Service or something, and maybe that's true. But I also think it wasn't part of the narrative. It wasn't part of, I wasn't saying anything like, yes, this is a really big deal. I wanted to hear more. And then by the next day, it became clear that the invitation had not come from, from the Holy See, not from Pope Francis, and it had actually been within a group. So I think it was unfortunate the way that so quickly after he left, and what had been a moment of unity immediately went back into our polarized camps. So I think, if anything, the long-term effect, I think there were probably there was a lot of frustration. Pope Francis himself spoke on it and clarified, which indicated to me that he was not happy with however it happened, and he was kind of blindsided by it. So I think it was overblown in the media by it. I think when he the only people that he did meet with were that he requested to meet with were his old friend from Argentina. So I thought the Vatican response to him was very telling. And we still don't know who arranged the visit. I mean, it's the Apostolic Nuncio, Vigano, who was said to have, but we don't know which American bishop, or if it was an American bishop that arranged that. You had a question?
Yeah, I was at the Mass in Philadelphia. I kept running into Notre Dame students. They're all wearing the same hoodies.
Yeah.
And I finally asked some of them what was going on.
Yeah.
and they said something on the order of 14 busloads, about 700 students. Could you comment a bit
Sure.
about how that was organized?
There were actually 9 busloads. I had to get this straight because, they had announced last spring that there would be a pilgrimage, and they had room for about 500, and the list filled up almost immediately. This is remarkable to me because of the difficult housing situation in Philadelphia and the logistics of it. They left here on Saturday night. They left in the third quarter of the game, drove through the night, arrived in Philadelphia in about 7:30 in the morning, had Pop-Tarts for breakfast. I was texting with Father Pete McCormick, the head of campus ministry, to get updates that I could then use on air. So I told everybody that the Notre Dame students had Pop-Tarts for breakfast. They liked that. Spent all day on Sunday, and then attended the final mass. Got back on the bus at 8 o'clock at night and drove through the night again. And as Ann Thompson said, only 18-year-olds, people in the age 18 to 22 could think about doing that. But yeah, it was wonderful, and I was able to interview some of them as part of my preparation work for that, to talk about why they were going, what was drawing them there. And then, I don't see myself as, my role is not to promote Notre Dame, but when Brian Williams, the first afternoon, he brought up Notre Dame 4 times in the space of an hour and would say things like, "Professor, what do they say at Notre Dame about this?" "Well, fine, I'm going to talk about Notre Dame." And I talked about the pilgrimage, and so that was a really great way to talk about how excited young people were about him. So yeah, they didn't have tickets. Another thing in Philadelphia was, it was hard. Did you have a ticket? Did you?
I waited for 4 hours to get into the mass.
But you got in?
Got in right before you.
Okay, and then many people had tickets and waited and didn't get in. Notre Dame students went to the right checkpoint. They did not have tickets, but they did get in. So it was that was a little disappointing to many people, I know, but yeah.
Others, questions, comments? Kathy, I'm curious, you did a fantastic job giving us a sense of what it was like, your whole experience. If you had to sum it up in 3 words, what would they be?
Now, even on TV, you're allowed more than 3 words, Sharon. Yeah, exhilarating is just one word, I guess. Though it just, everything about it was exhilarating. It was great. It was fun.
Wonderful. Well, on behalf of the Alumni Association, our alumni and friends, thank you so much, Dr. Cummings, for sharing it.